Welcome to today's Explainer. Every now and then you come across a scenario so surreal, it honestly feels like a glitch in history itself. Today, we're diving straight into one of those mind-bending what-ifs. We're going to look at a world where the entire map of global power gets fundamentally flipped upside down by just one single historical twist. So imagine waking up tomorrow morning to a headline that completely shatters our modern understanding of geopolitics. And to be clear, we aren't talking about some old museum piece or a dusty map in a textbook. We're talking about an actual, living reality that changes the entire balance of world history.
Alaska is still Russian. Seriously, just let that sink in for a second. Imagine standing on the coast of Washington State, looking north, and knowing that a rival superpower is sitting literally right up the coast. Imagine Russian flags flying over this massive frozen frontier right here on the North American continent. Imagine Russian military jets patrolling the skies above the Arctic, their ports facing out into the Pacific, and radar stations sitting right on the edge of the continent, staring directly at the northern border of the United States. It's crazy to think about, right? One single sentence, and the entire trajectory of world history bends. It ripples through absolutely everything: military strategy, climate, global trade, even national identity.
To really grasp how monumental this is, we have to look back at where the timeline split. In our actual reality, back in 1867, the United States bought Alaska for a mere $7.2 million. At the time, people actually mocked it. They called it Seward's folly. But in our alternate timeline, that sale just never happens. The Tsar flat out refuses, or maybe they just delay it, and ultimately Russia decides to double down on its hold. So instead of this neat little real estate transfer, the Russian Empire hangs on to this frozen giant through the revolution, through its collapse, and through its reinvention. And that one decision, it changes the whole shebang.
There's this fantastic quote from the source material: "Geography has a way of surviving ideology," and it is absolutely spot on. Even way before the Cold War, back during the 19th century imperial rivalries, having Russia parked in North America would be a constant, nagging irritation for both the United States and Britain. British and American strategists wouldn't just look up north and see a bunch of empty wilderness. They'd see a glaring, massive vulnerability. A Russian Alaska would be this permanent pressure point in literally every single diplomatic negotiation. It's the kind of territory that reminds everybody that empires don't just vanish cleanly, They leave their geography behind.
So let's fast forward a bit to the 20th century and see how this really escalates. How does having a neighbor across the water change the entire dynamic of the Cold War? In our real timeline, the Soviet adversary was distant. They were kept at arm's length by the Atlantic and the Pacific. But in this timeline, the United States has to stare directly at a Soviet landmass across the incredibly narrow Bering Strait. The North is no longer just this vast, empty buffer zone. It's the front line.
This dynamic creates something that strategists call emotional geography. It's basically the psychological shock, the deep unease, that hits when a distant global rivalry is suddenly parked right in your backyard. The Cold War shifts from these abstract battles across oceans to a highly volatile, incredibly live line of tension right there in the north. American air defense planners wouldn't just be sweating over Europe or East Asia, they would be absolutely obsessed with the Arctic frontier. It makes the threat feel closer, way more immediate, and frankly, a lot more terrifying. You can actually trace how this pressure builds up over the decades. In the late 19th century, it's just this nagging irritation. Then, hit the mid-20th century and you'd see absolutely explosive growth for NORAD, fueled by early Cold War paranoia. And by the late 20th century, we're talking a high-stakes, incredibly tense nuclear standoff. Places like Anchorage, the mountain passes, the air corridors, they all become this heavily fortified high-stakes chessboard. Air bases, radar systems, missile sites, submarine access. It all transforms the territory into a live standoff that could literally ignite at any given second. Every single inch of terrain suddenly matters.
But hey, geopolitics isn't solely about military might, right? It's heavily about money and resources. So what happens when Russia controls the ultimate northern energy vault? Alaska is staggeringly rich in natural resources. In our real timeline, Alaskan oil and gas contributed massively to U.S. strategic independence, which, by the way, is a big part of what kept the price you pay at the gas pump relatively stable. But in this alternate world, all of that incredible wealth goes somewhere else entirely.
Instead of fueling America, this staggering wealth feeds directly into Russian state power and their global leverage. Just look at this list. We are talking total oil and gas dominance, direct access to crucial rare earth minerals, physical control over the Northwest Passage, unmatched maritime influence, and just sprawling Arctic military bases. The rest of the world wouldn't just have to ask what Russia wants politically, they would literally have to bow to what Russia controls physically. It's a massive shift in leverage.
And here's the thing, this brilliant stroke of geographic luck only compounds as we move into the 21st century. As climate change continues to melt the ice, the Arctic is no longer just this frozen, impassable edge of the map. It becomes a major corridor of power. New sea routes are opening up, and a Russian-held Alaska would act like this giant northern anchor. It would effectively turn Russia into the undisputed master of the Arctic horizon, giving them a total stranglehold over the northern sea route. That is a real game changer, because it means they could cut global shipping times by days and control the literal flow of everyday global goods.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like an absolute slam dunk for Moscow, but actually, it wouldn't be entirely easy for them. From Moscow's perspective, sure, it's immense prestige. It's undeniable proof that Russia is this massive transcontinental Arctic empire. But on the ground, it would be an agonizing economic nightmare. Mother Nature doesn't really care about your imperial pride when it's 40 below zero and you're trying to pave a highway. Developing this land means fighting brutal weather, carrying massive infrastructure burdens, and dealing with enormously expensive logistical costs. So Alaska would really be this tricky mix of opportunity and burden for the Russian state. It grants incredible power, but it demands a massive sacrifice in return.
All right, let's pivot and look at the profound psychological shock this would cause inside the United States. The number one question everyone would be asking is, would the United States try to take it back? Having a major rival superpower sitting directly on the continental mainland would be basically impossible for the American public to just ignore. It becomes this glaring symbol of an unfinished rivalry right on their doorstep.
The domestic fallout in the U.S. would be an absolute obsession. Imagine military budgets just skyrocketing, specifically earmarked for northern defense, which means billions of your tax dollars perpetually diverted just to guard the snow. Entire political careers, even presidential elections, would be dominated by fierce promises to either neutralize or reclaim this massive geographic threat. There would be this constant looming background fear of northern vulnerability. And because of that, the U.S. would be forced into incredibly deep, permanent defense ties with Canada just to maintain some kind of buffer zone.
There's a line from the analysis that says Alaska was never just far away, it was a gateway. And in this timeline, Alaska acts as this permanent ghost in the room. Every single military exercise, every diplomatic meeting, every tense interaction between Washington and Moscow would carry this subtle, quiet, yet incredibly heavy undertone that Russian power is standing right at the gates of North America.
And as you'd expect, this intense fear radically redirects American strategy. Just look at how the priorities would shift. The Arctic border wouldn't just be some afterthought, it would completely eclipse both the European and Pacific theaters as the absolute highest defense priority. U.S. military spending and strategic planning would be permanently rewired to prioritize securing the northern doorstep over almost any other global arena.
So let's bring this all the way to the present day. How does this setup reshape a modern-day flashpoint? Imagine a 21st century crisis, with Russia happening today while a watchful China is observing the Arctic with growing interest. The stakes aren't just high in some abstract, faraway sense, they are physically right on top of North America.
Let's actually map out how a worst-case scenario unfolds here. Step 1. A crisis erupts over in Eastern Europe or maybe in cyberspace. Step 2. Instantly, that tension triggers a chain reaction across the Arctic ice because the front lines are so intimately connected. And Step 3. Within hours, the Bering Strait becomes a terrifying escalation node. Distant geopolitical conflicts would instantly spill into North America, turning the naval and air routes right above the U.S. into immediate live battlegrounds. A move in the Baltic suddenly impacts the Pacific, making the world feel smaller, tighter, and infinitely more dangerous.
And the invisible tightrope of modern aviation makes this whole situation even more volatile. As the source material points out, a place that looks empty on a satellite map can actually be loaded with tension invisible to the eye. Civil and military pilots flying across the north would be navigating not just tricky weather, but deep historical tension. The airspace would be heavily monitored and highly contested. A single airspace violation, one false alarm, or a misunderstood interception could literally spark a global war.
Which really leaves us with one final, incredibly powerful question to chew on. Would the world be safer or more dangerous? It's a bit of a paradox, actually. It might have made the U.S. far more cautious, and it certainly would have left Russia stretched pretty thin. But it undoubtedly would have made the world's geography far more intimate and explosive. A single territory, one delayed deal back in 1867, would forever change the global map of fear and power, turning the North into a permanent zone of suspicion. It really forces us to ask, what happens when the ice melts and the empires are already standing face to face? It's a fascinating thought, and it absolutely goes to show how geography truly dictates destiny.